Welcome to Clandestine Cases, Chapter 1. It was on an autumn evening of 1894, as a persistent drizzle cloaked the gaslit streets of London, that Sherlock Holmes and I found ourselves in our familiar sitting room at 221B Baker Street. The fire crackled pleasantly, warding off the damp chill that had settled over the city. Holmes, reclining in his armchair, was engrossed in an experiment involving a collection of glass phials and a smouldering piece of charred cloth. He regarded it with the same intensity that others might reserve for a matter of life and death. Had been perusing the latest edition of the Times, when the stillness of the evening was interrupted by a brisk rapping at the door. Before Mrs. Hudson could even stir, Holmes lifted his head. A man of means, Watson. His step is too decisive for a commoner, but not urgent enough for a desperate man. He hesitated at the threshold, suggesting some inner conflict. Holmes barely finished speaking when Mrs. Hudson ushered in a tall, well-dressed gentleman. He was perhaps in his early 40s, with greying temples and an air of noble distinction about him. Yet his face was drawn, his expression a peculiar blend of fear and restrained frustration. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired, though it was evident that he already knew the answer. Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, and this is my associate, Dr. Watson. Please take a seat. You appear troubled, sir." The man sat, pulling off his gloves with a nervous energy. "My name is Lord Reginald Ashcombe. I am in dire need of your assistance, Mr. Holmes, for I have found myself entangled in a mystery that defies all logic." Holmes steepled his fingers. "I find that most intriguing. Pray, elaborate." Lord Ashcombe exhaled deeply. "It concerns a rather disturbing event that took place 2 nights ago at my estate in Richmond. My wife's younger brother, a promising young scholar named Edwin Forsyth, was found dead in his study, under the most baffling of circumstances." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "Baffling, you say? In what manner?" "The room was locked from the inside," Lord Ashcombe explained, his voice thick with tension. "There was no sign of forced entry, no weapon, no apparent wounds, and yet—" His face bore an expression of unspeakable terror, and the entire chamber was filled with a strange crimson mist, an unnatural fog that vanished within moments of the door being forced open. I leaned forward, my medical instincts piqued. "A crimson mist? You are quite certain of this?" Lord Ashcombe nodded grimly. "The servants who found him swear upon it. It was as if the very air had turned to blood before their eyes. Mr. Holmes, I'm a rational man, but I cannot explain what has happened. The police are equally perplexed, dismissing it as a tragedy with no culprit. But I do not believe it to be a mere misfortune. Something is responsible for my brother-in-law's death, and I implore you to uncover the truth." For a long moment Holmes remained silent, his keen mind already whirring through possibilities. Then, with the faintest flicker of a smile, he stood. "Watson, fetch your coat. We have a mystery to unravel." Chapter 2. The hansom cab rattled through the rain-slicked streets of London as we made our way to Lord Ashcombe's estate in Richmond. Holmes sat in a contemplative silence, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed on the shadowed city beyond the window. I knew better than to interrupt him when his mind was thus engaged. Lord Ashcombe, by contrast, was restless. He sat opposite us, his gloved hands gripping his knee, his brow furrowed with visible distress. The gas lamps flickered outside as he finally spoke, his voice betraying his inner turmoil. "Mr. Holmes, I fear that this is not merely a crime. It is something beyond the ordinary. That mist, that crimson fog. There is no rational explanation for it." Holmes did not respond at once. Instead, he tapped his forefinger lightly against his knee, his eyes still fixed on the cityscape. "Tell me, Lord Ashcombe," he said at last, "was your brother-in-law an academic?" "Yes, a scholar of some distinction," Ashcombe replied. "He was a historian, deeply interested in ancient manuscripts, particularly those of Eastern origin. He spent much of his time studying rare texts and translating obscure writings." Holmes exhaled through his nose, almost a whisper of amusement. "Curious," he murmured. "And tell me, what of his personal life? Had he any enemies, disputes?" Ashcombe hesitated. "Not to my knowledge. Edwin was a reserved man, quite private about his work. If he had quarrels, he never spoke of them to me." Holmes nodded as though filing this information away for later scrutiny. And this study of his, where he was found, was it locked habitually? "Always," Ashcombe said. "Edwin valued his solitude. He kept the key on his person at all times, and the door had a sturdy lock. That is what makes this all so confounding, Mr. Holmes. No one could have entered, and yet he was dead." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "And the mist? You mentioned that it dissipated quickly." "Yes, within moments. By the time I arrived, there was only the faintest trace of it, barely perceptible. But the servants who discovered him swear it was thick enough to obscure the room entirely." Holmes settled back, his fingers now pressed together in his customary pose of reflection. "And the body? Did you notice anything unusual? Any sign of poisoning, a wound, discoloration?" Lord Ashcombe hesitated, his expression darkening. "No wounds, but his face. It was frozen in an expression of sheer horror. His eyes wide, unblinking, his mouth slightly open, as if he had seen something beyond comprehension in his final moments." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Fascinating," he said softly. The cab drew to a halt before Ashcombe's estate, a grand but solemn structure, its tall windows dark against the dreary night. A uniformed butler awaited us at the entrance, his demeanor stiff but betraying a flicker of unease as he ushered us inside. "The room has been left undisturbed as per your instructions, my lord," the butler informed Ashcombe, as he led us down a dimly lit corridor. "The police conducted their examination, but they found nothing of note." Holmes swept a glance over the hallway, his keen eyes darting over the fine woodwork, the polished floor, the faint shadows cast by the flickering candle sconces. "How many people reside in this house?" "My wife, Lady Eleanor, myself, and the staff. 8 servants in total. Edwin had his own quarters in the East Wing, where he preferred solitude." At the end of the corridor, the butler halted before a heavy oak door. "This is the study, sir," he said. Holmes stepped forward, his gloved hand brushing lightly over the doorknob. He examined it for several long moments, running his fingers along the edges, testing the weight of the door itself. Then, without a word, he pulled out his magnifying glass and scrutinized the lock. Watson and Ashcombe watched in silence as Holmes crouched, his gaze roving over the floor, the edges of the threshold, the hinges, every minute detail scrutinized with the utmost care. At last he straightened and fixed Lord Ashcombe with an inscrutable expression. "Open it." The butler produced a small iron key, his hand trembling slightly as he inserted it into the lock. With a slow creak, the door swung inward. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, the heavy drapes drawn tightly against the night. The air within carried a faint, lingering scent, something metallic, tinged with an acrid undertone. The gas lamps flickered to life as Holmes stepped inside. There, at the grand mahogany desk, was the chair where Edwin Forsyth had met his untimely demise. The impression of his presence remained, his inkstand undisturbed, a book left open upon the desk, his spectacles folded neatly beside it. And yet, an eerie stillness hung over the chamber, as though the very walls retained the memory of the terror that had unfolded within. Holmes moved with calculated precision, his gaze sweeping over the bookshelves, the fireplace, the ornate carpet. Then he stopped abruptly. On the floor, just beneath the desk, a single object caught the dim light, a small circular stain. Holmes knelt, his expression unreadable. "Watson," he said quietly, "your expertise, if you please." I moved to his side and examined the stain. It was dark, almost imperceptible against the deep red of the carpet. I touched it lightly with my fingers. Dried, but unmistakably blood. A drop of blood, I murmured. But no wounds on the body. This is most peculiar. Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. "Indeed," he said, "and yet I believe we have taken our first step toward understanding the nature of the crimson fog." He rose abruptly. "Lord Ashcombe, I require an inventory of every book your brother-in-law possessed, particularly those of an Eastern origin." Ashcombe blinked. "Books? What do they have to do with—" Holmes held up a hand. "All in due time, my lord. For now, we must follow the blood. Watson, bring the lamp closer. This mystery has only begun to unfold." And with that, Holmes crouched once more, tracing the faintest trail that led beyond the desk toward the shadows of the unlit fireplace. Chapter 3. Holmes remained crouched by the fireplace, his gaze following the near-invisible trail of dried blood that led from beneath the desk to the dark recesses of the hearth. The flickering lamplight cast shifting shadows upon the walls, lending an eerie atmosphere to the already unsettling room. Lord Ashcombe lingered by the doorway, his face tight with concern. "What do you hope to find, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes did not immediately respond. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small glass vial. With meticulous precision, he scraped a portion of the dried stain onto a thin blade and deposited it into the vial. "Watson, you noted the metallic scent in the air, did you not?" Holmes asked as he straightened. "Indeed," I replied, stepping closer to examine the carpet once more. "It is faint but unmistakable. Blood, perhaps, but there is something more, something acrid." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Precisely. And that, my dear Watson, is the key to understanding the nature of the crimson fog." Before I could inquire further, he turned his attention back to the fireplace. The hearth was empty. save for a scattering of fine ash. Holmes took a pinch of it between his fingers, rubbing it lightly before bringing it to his nose. "Curious," he murmured. "Lord Ashcombe, when was the last time this fireplace was used?" Ashcombe frowned. Edwin rarely lit a fire in here. He was always mindful of his books and papers. I would say several weeks ago at least. Holmes examined the grate with keen interest. Then, with a sudden movement, he reached for the poker that stood beside the hearth and began tapping along the edges of the bricks. A hollow sound echoed from one section. A slow smile crept onto Holmes's face. "Ah," he said, "Watson, would you be so kind as to assist me?" Together, we pried loose a single brick from the back of the fireplace. As it came free, a small cavity was revealed, no larger than a man's fist. Within it lay a bundle wrapped in aged yellowing cloth. "Doctor," Ashcombe let out a quiet gasp. "What is that?" Holmes withdrew the bundle and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a thin, leather-bound book, its cover cracked with age. Faded, indecipherable script adorned its front, and its pages were edged with a faint red hue, as though stained by time itself. Holmes turned the book over in his hands, his expression unreadable. "A text of significance, I should think," he mused. "Lord Ashcombe, does this belong to your late brother-in-law?" Ashcombe hesitated before nodding. "It must. Edwin collected many rare manuscripts, though I cannot say I have seen this one before." De Camille opened the book, flipping through its delicate pages. Strange symbols filled the parchment. Elegant flowing script, unlike any language I had encountered. Holmes paused on one page in particular, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Fascinating," he murmured. "Watson, what do you make of this?" I leaned in, noting the elaborate illustrations that accompanied the text. A series of intricate diagrams depicted human figures surrounded by swirling mists. One image in particular stood out. A man seated in a chair, his face contorted in terror as a crimson vapor engulfed him. A chill ran down my spine. "Holmes, this is no ordinary manuscript." "Indeed not," Holmes agreed, his voice low. "And I would wager that Edwin Forsyth understood its significance all too well." At that moment, a sharp sound broke the silence. A soft creak, so faint it could have been dismissed as the shifting of the old house. But Holmes reacted instantly. He snapped the book shut and turned sharply toward the door. "Who is there?" For a long moment there was no answer. Then, from the hallway beyond, a quiet voice responded. A woman's voice, low and hesitant. "It is I, Eleanor." Lady Eleanor Ashcombe stepped into the dimly lit study, her dark eyes flickering with uncertainty. She was a striking woman, her auburn hair swept up in a neat chignon, her expression composed yet shadowed with worry. She hesitated just inside the doorway, glancing from Holmes to her husband before settling her gaze on the small book in Holmes's hands. "You have found it," she said softly. Holmes studied her intently. "You were aware of its existence." She nodded, folding her hands in front of her. "My brother was secretive about his work, but I knew he possessed certain texts. He spoke of them rarely, but when he did, he was always cautious, almost fearful." "Did he ever mention this book in particular?" Holmes pressed. Lady Eleanor hesitated, her expression troubled. Only once, he called it the Crimson Codex. Holmes's eyes flashed with interest. Did he say what it contained? She swallowed, glancing at her husband before answering. He said it was a record of ancient knowledge that was never meant to be unearthed. Silence settled over the room like a thick fog. Holmes tapped a finger against the book's cover. "Lord Ashcombe, Lady Eleanor, I believe your brother's death was no mere accident, nor the result of ordinary foul play." He lifted the book slightly. "This, I suspect, is at the heart of it." Lord Ashcombe ran a hand through his hair, his face etched with worry. "But what does it mean? And how does it relate to the mist?" Holmes smiled faintly. "That, my dear lord, is what we must now determine." He turned to me. "Watson, I believe our next course of action is clear. We must uncover the secrets of the Crimson Codex, and quickly, before this mystery claims another life." And with that, Holmes tucked the ancient book into the folds of his coat, its sharp gaze lingering on the darkened doorway. For somewhere in the depths of Ashcombe Manor, someone else was listening. Chapter 4, The Discovery of the Crimson Codex had shifted the case from the realm of the bizarre into something altogether more ominous. Holmes, ever the pragmatist, had insisted on taking the book back to Baker Street for further examination. But Lord Ashcombe, his face etched with concern, had pleaded for him to remain at the estate. "If this book is as dangerous as you suggest, Mr. Holmes, I fear for my household. Edwin kept his secrets well, but they may not have died with him." Holmes regarded him with a thoughtful expression. "A reasonable concern, my lord," he admitted. "We shall stay for the night, provided Watson has no objections." I did not. There was something unsettling about Ashcombe Manor, a presence lingering within its halls that sent a chill through my spine. Holmes had sensed it too. I could see it in the way his gaze darted subtly toward the shadowed corners of the study, in the way his fingers tightened ever so slightly around the codex. Lady Eleanor seemed relieved by the decision, though she kept her distance, her hands clasped together as though to steady herself. "I shall have rooms prepared," she said quietly, before retreating into the dimly lit corridor. As the clock neared midnight, we found ourselves gathered once more in Edwin Forsyth's study. The gas lamps turned low as Holmes carefully laid the Crimson Codex upon the desk. The leather binding was worn, the pages delicate with age. Holmes turned them with meticulous care, his eyes scanning the elaborate script and intricate diagrams. "Watson," he murmured, "I trust you have encountered a variety of medical texts in your time?" "Certainly," I replied, "but I have never seen anything quite like this." Holmes traced a gloved finger over the faded ink. "Neither have I," he admitted, "but I recognize elements. This script bears similarities to Persian and Sanskrit, yet it is neither." Lord Ashcombe, seated across from us, leaned forward. "What do you believe it contains?" Holmes flipped to a section marked with an E, ornate symbol, a blood-red sigil pressed into the parchment. The illustration beside it was chilling. A robed figure, seated before a burning brazier, tendrils of smoke curling upward, forming ghastly shapes in the air. "A ritual of some kind," Holmes muttered. I exchanged a glance with Ashcombe. "Surely you don't believe I believe, Holmes interrupted, that Edwin Forsyth was in possession of knowledge that someone did not wish him to have. Whether that knowledge was mystical or scientific is irrelevant. What matters is that it led to his death. He tapped the sigil with his index finger. And I intend to discover why. A sudden knock at the door shattered the silence. We turned as the butler, his normally composed expression laced with unease, stepped into the room. "My lord," he said hesitantly, "there is a situation." Lord Ashcombe stiffened. "What is it?" The butler's Adam's apple bobbed. "One of the servants, sir, Miss Beatrice, the scullery maid. She claims she saw something outside her window not half an hour ago." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "What precisely did she see?" The butler hesitated. "She says she saw a mist, my lord. A crimson mist, drifting near the east wing." A heavy silence fell over the room. Holmes was the first to move. He snapped the codex shut, tucking it beneath his arm as he strode toward the door. "Watson, Lord Ashcombe, come quickly. If this mist has returned, I fear we may be closer to the heart of this mystery than we anticipated." We followed him through the dimly lit corridors of Ashcombe Manor. The heavy silence of the house, broken only by the soft echo of our hurried footsteps. At last, we reached the servants' quarters. The young maid, Beatrice, stood by the window, her hands clasped. Together, her face pale as moonlight. She turned as we entered, her eyes darting anxiously toward Lord Ashcombe. "I swear it, my lord," she whispered. "I saw it with my own eyes." Holmes approached the window, peering out into the mist-laden night. "Describe what you saw," he instructed. Beatrice swallowed hard. "At first, I thought it was just the fog rolling in from the river. But it wasn't normal. It was red, like smoke rising from a fire. But there was no fire. It moved, Mr. Holmes. It moved as though it were alive. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. And then, Beatrice hesitated. It disappeared. It just vanished, as if it had never been there at all." Holmes studied her for a moment, then turned back to the window. The grounds beyond were cloaked in darkness, the trees casting long, twisted shadows across the lawn. He remained silent for several long moments before finally stepping back. "We must inspect the east wing," he said at last. "Immediately." Lord Ashcombe nodded, though there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. "I shall have the groundskeeper accompany us." "No," Holmes said sharply. "This must be done quietly. If someone or something is watching, we must not alert them." And so, with only the dim glow of lanterns to guide us, we made our way through the darkened halls toward the east wing, toward the last place the crimson mist had been seen. What awaited us there, none could say. But as we walked through the silent corridors of Ashcombe Manor, a single thought echoed in my mind. Mystery was only beginning. Chapter 5. The silence within Ashcombe Manor was as thick as the mist outside. The only sound was the faint creak of the floorboards beneath our hurried steps as we made our way toward the east wing. Holmes walked ahead, his movements swift but deliberate, his eyes darting to every shadowed corner and unlit corridor. I followed close behind, gripping my lantern tightly. While Lord Ashcombe kept pace at my side, his face drawn with tension. Beatrice's description of the crimson mist had unsettled me more than I cared to admit. Fog was a common enough sight in London, but a mist that moved with intent, that vanished without a trace, was something else entirely. It gnawed at the edges of logic, and yet I knew better than to let fear dictate my thoughts. Holmes would have no patience for it. As we reached the eastern corridor, Holmes halted abruptly, raising a gloved hand to signal silence. We obeyed at once, then I heard it. A sound, so faint, so barely perceptible, that I almost doubted my own ears. It was the whisper of movement, the unmistakable rustling of fabric against stone. Somewhere beyond the gloom, someone or something was there. Holmes gestured to Lord Ashcombe, who dimmed his lantern. We moved forward cautiously, stepping lightly upon the Persian runner that lined the hallway. The passage led to an old wooden door at the far end, its iron handle dulled with age. Holmes placed a hand upon it and turned, but it did not yield. "Locked," he murmured. I turned to Lord Ashcombe. "Who has access to this room?" "No one," he whispered. "It has been unoccupied for years." Holmes withdrew a set of slender lockpicks from his pocket and knelt before the door. In the dim glow of our lanterns, I watched his hands move with practiced precision. A soft click broke the silence, and Holmes slowly pushed the door open. A gust of cold air greeted us, carrying with it a scent that set my nerves on edge. A strange blend of damp stone, old parchment, and something faintly metallic. The room beyond was small, lined with bookshelves that sagged beneath the weight of their neglected contents. A single writing desk stood against the far wall, coated in a thick layer of dust. The fireplace was dark, its grate filled with long cold ashes, and yet something was wrong. Holmes stepped inside, sweeping his lantern in a slow arc. "Watson," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Observe." I followed his gaze and felt a chill run through me. Footprints, they marred the layer of dust upon the wooden floor, weaving an erratic path between the bookshelves and the desk. Some were deep, as though the intruder had moved with haste. Others were lighter, uncertain. But it was not the presence of the footprints that unsettled me. It was their clarity. "These are fresh," I whispered. "Someone was here." Holmes knelt, his fingers tracing the edges of one particularly distinct impression. His brow furrowed. "And not long ago," he agreed. "The dust has not yet settled." Lord Ashcombe exhaled sharply. "But who? And why?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved toward the desk, his keen gaze scanning its contents. A few scattered papers lay atop it, yellowed with age, but Holmes ignored them. His attention was fixed on something else. A candle. It stood in an ornate brass holder, its wick burned down, but only slightly. Holmes touched it lightly. "Still warm," he murmured. "Our visitor was here within the hour." A sudden noise outside made us all turn sharply, a faint but deliberate sound, like the creak of a loose floorboard. Holmes was at the door in an instant, his lantern held high as he peered into the hallway. I strained my ears, listening for any further movement, but there was nothing, only the heavy silence of the house pressing in on us. Holmes turned back, his expression unreadable. "They were watching us," he said quietly. and now they are gone." Lord Ashcombe swallowed hard. "You think it was the same person responsible for my brother-in-law's death?" Holmes considered this for a moment. "Perhaps," he said at last, "or perhaps someone who knows more than they wish us to discover." His gaze flickered toward the bookshelves. Without a word, he began running his hands along their edges, pressing lightly against the wood. I watched in silence, accustomed to his methods, knowing that he was searching for something unseen. And then, a soft click, a section of the shelf shifted beneath his fingers. Slowly, deliberately, Holmes pressed it inward. The bookshelf groaned and then swung open. Behind it lay a narrow passage, shrouded in darkness. Lord Ashcombe took an involuntary step back. A hidden corridor. Holmes smiled faintly. An old house such as this is bound to hold its secrets. He reached into his coat and withdrew a second lantern, lighting it swiftly before stepping forward. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for a single man to pass through. The walls were lined with rough-hewn stone, damp with age. Holmes turned back to us. "Shall we?" Lord Ashcombe hesitated. I could see the doubt flicker in his expression, the weight of fear pressing upon his mind. But he squared his shoulders and nodded. "Let's end this mystery, Mr. Holmes." And so, with the flickering light of our lanterns casting long shadows upon the walls, we stepped into the unknown. Beyond the hidden door, the truth awaited us. Chapter 6. The narrow passage exhaled a breath of stale, damp air as we stepped inside, our lanterns casting flickering shadows upon the rough stone walls. Holmes led the way, moving with quiet precision, his eyes darting across every surface, every imperfection in the stone. I followed close behind, the weight of unease settling deep in my chest. Lord Ashcombe hesitated for only a moment before steeling himself and stepping in after us. The hidden door swung back into place behind him with a dull thud, sealing us within the passage. The silence that followed was heavy, save for the distant rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the darkness. "Fascinating," Holmes murmured, running his fingers along the damp wall. "A hidden corridor within Ashcombe Manor. How curious that your late brother-in-law never spoke of it." Lord Ashcombe exhaled sharply. "Edwin was a private man, but I cannot believe he knew of this. I certainly never did." Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he pressed onward, following the slight incline of the passage as it curved to the left. The floor beneath us was uneven, scattered with debris and dust. But then, suddenly, the dust thinned. The air felt different, less stagnant. Holmes paused, holding up a hand. "Someone has used this passage recently." I frowned. "How can you tell?" He gestured toward the ground. "Observe. The dust here is disturbed. The further we move, the less settled it becomes. Someone has passed through this way, and not long ago, a chill ran through me. Then they may still be here." Holmes's sharp gaze flickered toward me. "Precisely." We continued in tense silence, each footstep careful, deliberate. The passageway stretched deeper into the house, its walls tightening around us like a clenched fist. Then, after several minutes, we reached another door. This one smaller, wooden, fitted into the stone like an afterthought. Holmes pressed his ear against it, listening. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, A whisper. Faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. A hushed murmur, as if someone was speaking just beyond the door. I held my breath. Lord Ashcombe stiffened beside me. Holmes, however, remained perfectly composed. Slowly, carefully, he tested the handle. It did not move. Locked, he whispered. But from which side? He withdrew his lockpicks once more and knelt before the door. The faint metallic click of his tools working at the mechanism was the only sound in the heavy silence. My pulse quickened. Whoever was beyond this door, if they were still there, could not be unaware of our presence. Then, with a final snap, the lock yielded. Holmes rose fluidly, exchanging a glance with me and Lord Ashcombe. Without another word, he pushed the door open. The room beyond was dimly lit by the flickering glow of a single oil lamp. It was smaller than the study, its walls lined with more bookshelves, more aged tomes stacked carelessly in piles. The air was thick with an earthy, musky scent. Parchment, ink, and something else. Something acrid. And then I saw him. A man stood in the far corner of the room, half hidden by the shadows. He was thin, almost gaunt, his skin pale beneath the lamplight. His clothes were disheveled, his hair unkempt, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps, his eyes wild darting, fixed on us the moment we entered. Holmes stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Good evening," he said coolly. The man flinched as though struck. His hands trembled at his sides, his fingers curling inward, like claws. He took a step back, pressing himself against the bookshelf behind him. "Who are you?" Lord Ashcombe demanded, his voice tight with anger. "What are you doing in my house?" The man licked his lips, his gaze darting between us, calculating. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, rasping. "You shouldn't be here." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "And yet you are. Tell me, how long have you been hiding within this house?" The man said nothing. He seemed to shrink into himself, his breathing growing more erratic. Holmes took another step forward, his tone measured, controlled. "Your presence here is not an accident. You knew Edwin Forsyth, did you not?" A flicker of recognition, brief but unmistakable, crossed the man's face. Holmes seized upon it. "Ah, you did. And yet you did not wish for us to find you. Why?" The man's fingers twitched. He swallowed, hard, his throat working convulsively. Then, in a sudden frantic movement, he lunged for the oil lamp. Holmes was faster. Before the man could tip the flame, Holmes had seized his wrist in an iron grip, twisting it sharply. The man let out a strangled cry, the lamp slipping from his grasp. It struck the ground but did not shatter. "None of that," Holmes said, his voice dangerously quiet. "No more games. You will tell us what you know." The man gasped for breath, his strength fading beneath Holmes's unrelenting grip. You don't understand," he choked. Holmes narrowed his eyes, then enlightened me. The man's chest heaved, his limbs shaking. For a long moment I thought he would resist, that he would fight to the bitter end. But then, as though something inside him had broken, he slumped forward. His next words sent a chill through my blood. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he whispered. "I only wanted to warn him." Holmes's grip remained firm. but I could see the sharp intensity in his gaze. Warn who? The man swallowed. Edwin. A heavy silence filled the room. Holmes did not move, did not so much as blink. Then, in a voice as cold as steel, he asked, "Warn him of what?" The man's eyes flickered towards the crimson codex, which Holmes had tucked beneath his coat. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "The book. He never should have opened it." Chapter 7. The man's words hung in the air like a spectre. The book. He never should have opened it. Holmes's fingers loosened slightly on the man's wrist, though his sharp gaze did not waver. The tension in the dimly lit chamber was thick enough to suffocate. Lord Ashcombe shifted uneasily, his breathing shallow, while I found my grip tightening on the lantern handle. Holmes spoke first, his voice smooth but edged with steel. "You knew Edwin Forsyth," he said. It was not a question. The man hesitated. His gaze flickered to the door, as if measuring his chances of escape. Holmes noticed. "Do not attempt it," he advised coolly. "You would not reach the corridor before I had you by the collar." The man exhaled shakily. "Yes," he admitted at last. "I knew him." Holmes released his wrist, though he did not step back. "Your name?" The man hesitated, his throat working convulsively. "Henry Bracknell." Lord Ashcombe's brow furrowed. "That name means nothing to me." "It would not," Bracknell said hoarsely. "I was never meant to be here." Holmes folded his arms. "And yet here you are. Tell me, Bracknell, how did you come to be inside Ashcombe Manor?" Bracknell cast a glance toward the hidden passage behind us. "That tunnel, it leads beyond the manor walls. I've used it before." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Then you are no stranger to this place." Bracknell licked his lips. "No," he admitted, "not in recent years. But once, a long time ago, I knew this house well." Lord Ashcombe stepped forward. "Explain yourself." Bracknell hesitated, then let out a slow breath. "I was a bookseller," he said at last. "Or I used to be. Edwin Forsyth was one of my best customers." Holmes exchanged a glance with me before turning back to Bracknell. "A bookseller," he murmured. "And what, precisely, did you sell to Edwin?" Bracknell swallowed hard. "Rare texts, manuscripts, obscure volumes, ones that most collectors wouldn't dare seek out." His voice dropped. The Crimson Codex was one of them. A heavy silence fell over the room. Holmes's fingers drummed against his forearm. "You procured the book for him." Bracknell gave a short, humorless laugh. "Procured? No, Mr. Holmes. I warned him away from it. I told him it was not meant to be read, that it should have remained buried where it was found." Holmes's gaze darkened. "And yet you allowed it to pass into his hands." Bracknell's face twisted with guilt. "He wouldn't let it go. You didn't know Edwin. Once his mind was set on something, nothing could dissuade him. He wanted the book. Needed it," he swallowed. "I didn't realize how far he would go." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Bracknell hesitated, his fingers flexing nervously. "The book was cursed," he said finally. "Not in a supernatural way, not in the way fools speak of witches and devils, but in its knowledge. It was written centuries ago by a man whose name has been lost to time. A man who discovered something he should not have." Holmes's expression remained unreadable. And what precisely did this unknown author discover? Bracknell exhaled shakily. A means of inducing fear, of drawing terror out of the mind and making it manifest. Lord Ashcombe scoffed. This is madness. Bracknell's hollow gaze flickered toward him. Is it? He rasped. Then tell me, my lord, did you not witness it yourself? The crimson fog. A flicker of hesitation crossed Ashcombe's face. He said nothing. Bracknell turned back to Holmes. That mist is no ordinary vapor. It is something more, something Edwin should never have tampered with. He clenched his jaw. And now it has killed him. Holmes studied him for a long moment, his fingers pressing together beneath his chin. If you truly believe the book to be dangerous, he mused, then why are you here? Bracknell flinched. Holmes pressed on. You were hiding in this house, lurking in the shadows. Why? Did you fear for your own life? Or were you here to ensure the book never left Edwin Forsyth's hands? Bracknell took a step back, his breath quickening. No, I never meant. Holmes moved faster than I could follow. In an instant, he had closed the space between them, seizing Bracknell's collar and yanking him forward. The man let out a strangled gasp, his thin body trembling. There is more you have yet to tell us, Holmes said, his voice cold. I suggest you do so now. Bracknell's mouth opened and closed. His pupils shrank. His face turned pale, too pale. And then his body convulsed. I rushed forward just as his legs buckled beneath him. His chest heaved, his breath coming in sharp, rasping gasps. He gripped Holmes's coat in desperation, his fingers twitching, his lips moving. But no sound came forth. Watson! Holmes barked, quickly. I knelt beside Bracknell, my hands already at his throat, feeling for a pulse. His skin was ice cold, his heartbeat erratic. His eyes darted wildly before locking onto mine, filled with something beyond terror. A strangled, gasping whisper escaped his lips. It's here. And then his body stiffened. From the corridor beyond, a sound unlike any I had ever heard shuddered through the air. A low, twisting, unnatural hum. It was neither wind nor whisper, but something else entirely. Something that made my blood run cold. Holmes's grip on Bracknell tightened. What do you mean? He demanded. What is here? Bracknell's lips parted one final time. Then nothing. His body slackened, the light leaving his eyes. A chill ran through me as I felt for his pulse again. Nothing. Henry Bracknell, the man who had tried to warn Edwin Forsyth, was dead. Holmes remained frozen, his sharp gaze darting towards the corridor. The air had shifted. I felt it. Lord Ashcombe felt it. Even the dim oil lamp seemed to flicker in acknowledgement. Holmes inhaled sharply. Watson. I swallowed. Yes. He turned toward me, his expression grave. We are no longer alone. And in the doorway, from the very air itself, a thin wisp of crimson mist began to coil its way into the room. Chapter 8. A thin wisp of crimson mist curled into the doorway, slithering through the air like a living thing. The dim glow of the oil lamp flickered violently as the strange vapor drifted toward us, coiling and unfurling in slow, deliberate movements. Lord Ashcombe took a staggering step backward, his breath caught in his throat. Dear God. Holmes, ever the embodiment of rational thought, did not retreat. Instead, he stood firm, his sharp eyes fixed upon the creeping tendrils of mist. His gloved hand tightened ever so slightly around the lapels of his coat, the only sign that even he was affected by the unnatural sight before us. I forced my medical instincts to take precedence over my growing unease, and pressed my fingers to Bracknell's throat once more. No pulse, no breath. His body had turned deathly still in mere moments, yet his face, it was the same as Edwin Forsyth's. Mouth slightly parted, as though trying to voice a final warning. Eyes wide in sheer, unrelenting terror. Holmes's voice cut through the thick air. Watson, move away from the body. I did not need to be told twice. Rising to my feet, I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. The mist was inching forward, drifting with an intelligence that defied nature. Holmes turned to Lord Ashcombe. We must leave this room, now. Ashcombe did not argue. With one last horrified glance at Bracknell's lifeless body, he turned and strode toward the door. I followed, my movements brisk but controlled. Yet, just as we neared the threshold, Holmes halted. He did not move, he did not speak. His gaze remained locked upon the swirling mist, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something flicker across his face. Not fear, no, never fear, but something close to fascination. Holmes, I urged. Holmes exhaled sharply, as if snapping out of a trance. He turned on his heel and strode out, pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind him with a resounding thud. A terrible stillness settled over the corridor. The three of us stood there, breaths ragged, listening. The silence stretched on. Then, a faint rasping sound from within the room, like a whisper carried on the wind, like something shifting, stirring. Holmes turned to me. Watson, Lord Ashcombe, listen carefully. That was no ordinary mist. Ashcombe swallowed hard. I gathered as much, he muttered. Holmes continued, his tone clipped, measured. There is a rational explanation for what we have seen tonight. However, we are working against an opponent who understands the power of fear. This, he gestured toward the closed door, is not some ghostly force. It is something manufactured, something precise. I struggled to steady my breath. But Holmes Bracknell, he died within seconds. What could have done that? Holmes's expression darkened. That is precisely what I intend to find out. He stepped away from the door, adjusting the lapels of his coat. We must return to the study. The Crimson Codex holds the key to this mystery. Of that I am certain. Ashcombe still looked shaken, but he nodded. I won't argue, Mr. Holmes. But if what we just witnessed is not supernatural, then what is it? Holmes did not answer immediately. He strode down the corridor, his long strides purposeful. We followed swiftly, eager to put distance between ourselves and the ominous room behind us. As we reached the main hallway, Holmes finally spoke. It is a weapon, he said simply, one more insidious than any dagger or pistol. A means of killing without leaving a trace. I felt a cold dread settle within me. A poison. Holmes glanced at me. A possibility, he admitted, but not an ordinary one. We reached the study, and Holmes wasted no time. He strode to the desk and retrieved the Crimson Codex, flipping through its delicate pages with a speed that should have been reckless, but was instead precise. His sharp gaze scanned each line of faded text, his fingers pausing over certain passages. I watched in tense silence, Lord Ashcombe standing beside me, both of us waiting for Holmes's inevitable revelation. Then, Holmes's hand stilled over a particular page, his brows furrowed. "Here," he murmured. I stepped closer. The page was adorned with more strange script. But what caught my attention was the illustration beside it. A figure seated in a chair, much like the earlier depictions we had seen. But this one was different. The figure's mouth was open, as though mid-scream. Tendrils of swirling mist rose from a small brazier at their feet, curling around them like living chains. And beneath it, a single word had been circled in faded ink. Ethereum. I frowned. Ethereum. I have never heard of such a thing. Holmes' expression remained unreadable, nor have I, Watson, which makes it all the more intriguing. Lord Ashcombe peered over our shoulders. Could it be an element? A substance? Holmes tapped the page lightly. An excellent deduction, my lord. And if I am correct, it is the very thing responsible for the crimson mist. My mind reeled. Holmes, you cannot mean I do. Holmes closed the book with a decisive motion. This is no mere vapor, Watson. It is a compound, a volatile one. Ashcombe paled. Are you saying that my brother-in-law was murdered with this substance? Holmes nodded. Not just murdered, my lord. Experimented upon. A heavy silence fell. My stomach twisted. Then, whoever controls this Ethereum, Holmes exhaled, has found a way to turn fear itself into a weapon. A chill settled over the room, deeper than before. Holmes turned to me, his expression grave. Watson, we must uncover the origins of this substance, and quickly. I nodded, my pulse racing. And where do we start? Holmes's eyes darkened. With the last person known to have read the Crimson Codex before Edwin Forsyth. Lord Ashcombe straightened. And who might that be? Holmes turned a page and pointed to a name scrawled in the margins, written in the same faded ink that had circled the word Ethereum. The name was unfamiliar to me, but I saw a flicker of recognition in Lord Ashcombe's eyes. Holmes closed the book. It is time we paid a visit to Dr. Elias Rook. Chapter 9. The Journey to Dr. Elias Rook's residence was undertaken in haste. Holmes, ever the embodiment of restless energy, sat rigidly in the hansom cab, his sharp gaze fixed upon the rain-slicked streets of London. I could see the intricate calculations taking shape behind his eyes, his mind dissecting every detail of the case as if it were a mathematical puzzle. Lord Ashcombe, still pale from the night's events, sat across from us, gripping his gloved hands together. "Dr. Rook," he murmured, his voice edged with something close to unease. "It has been many years since I last heard that name." Holmes turned his attention toward him. "You knew him then?" Ashcombe nodded. "Not personally, but he was once a well-regarded scholar, an expert in alchemical texts and obscure scientific theories. He was unconventional." Holmes's brow arched. A polite term, I assume. Ashcombe hesitated. There were whispers, he admitted, that his work had become reckless, that he was delving into studies best left alone. Then, quite suddenly, he vanished from academic circles. Some said he had gone abroad. Others claimed he had been forced into seclusion. Holmes exhaled through his nose. And now his name appears within the Crimson Codex, in the same ink as Edwin Forsyth's notations. That is no coincidence. I frowned. If Rook truly studied this book, he may know the origins of the substance you believe to be responsible for Edwin's death. Holmes nodded. Precisely, Watson. Which means he may also know who else seeks to possess it. The cab rattled through the fog-drenched streets, the gas lamps casting distorted halos of light against the pavement. We pulled up before a tall, weathered townhouse in Bloomsbury, its shutters drawn tight, its facade betraying years of neglect. A single lamp flickered weakly on the doorstep, casting jagged shadows across the stone. Holmes was the first to step down. "It appears Dr. Rook prefers solitude," he observed. "A man who does not wish to be found." Lord Ashcombe hesitated. "Are we certain he is even still here?" Holmes strode to the door and rapped sharply 3 times. "If he is not, we shall soon know." We waited in tense silence. A minute passed, then another. No sound came from within. Holmes knocked again, firmer this time. Still nothing. I glanced at him. Perhaps he is asleep. Holmes tilted his head. Unlikely. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small thin blade, which he slipped expertly into the keyhole. With a swift flick of his wrist, there was a soft click, and the door creaked open. Lord Ashcombe looked aghast. "Breaking into a man's home, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes stepped inside without hesitation. "A necessary indiscretion, my lord. If Dr. Rook were inclined to welcome visitors, he would have done so already." I followed Holmes into the dimly lit hallway, Lord Ashcombe reluctantly at our heels. The house bore the unmistakable scent of age and dust. Stacks of books lined the walls haphazardly, towering toward the ceiling. A single candle flickered on a wooden table, its wax dripping slowly onto the surface. Holmes moved with the precision of a predator, his eyes scanning every surface, every shadow. "He is here," he murmured. "The air is not stale enough to suggest prolonged absence." I stepped forward cautiously. "Then where is he?" A creak. All 3 of us froze. From the upper floor, the faintest sound of movement, a shuffling step, a breath. Holmes lifted a hand, signaling silence. Then, with calculated swiftness, he ascended the staircase, his footsteps near soundless against the wooden boards. We followed, the tension thick enough to choke. At the top of the stairs, a long corridor stretched into the gloom. The air was cooler here, carrying a faint, acrid scent. The door at the far end stood slightly ajar, a sliver of golden candlelight spilling into the hallway. Holmes advanced without hesitation and pushed the door open. Inside, seated at an enormous desk cluttered with yellowed papers, was an elderly man. His skeletal frame was draped in a tattered robe, his long fingers ink-stained and trembling. A thick mane of unkempt white hair framed his sunken face, and his eyes, piercing, fever-bright, snapped toward us the instant we entered. "Dr. Fure Elias Rook." For a moment he simply stared. Then, in a rasping whisper, he said, "You should not have come." Holmes closed the door behind us. "On the contrary, Doctor," he said smoothly, It seems we are precisely where we need to be. Rook's lips parted, revealing yellowed teeth. You do not understand, he croaked. It is already too late. Holmes stepped forward. Too late for what? Rook exhaled shakily, his fingers twitching over the parchment before him. Forsyth, he whispered. The fool, he did not heed my warnings. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Then you did know him? Rook nodded weakly. He sought answers. He was not meant to find. He thought he could control it. My pulse quickened. Control what? Rook's head snapped up, his gaze burning into mine. The Ethereum. A chill ran through me. Holmes remained motionless, though I saw the flicker of satisfaction in his expression. You wrote about it, Holmes said. In the Crimson Codex. Rook let out a breath that was almost a laugh. No, he murmured. I only studied what was written before me. But Forsyth, he tried to go further. Holmes narrowed his eyes. How? Rook shuddered. By recreating it. Silence. Holmes's fingers curled slightly at his sides. You mean to say that Forsyth was experimenting with Ethereum? Rook swallowed. Not just experimenting. Perfecting. The weight of his words settled heavily over us. Lord Ashcombe's face had gone pale. Then, was it Forsyth who killed Bracknell? Rook's sunken eyes flickered with something unreadable. No, he rasped. Forsyth was dead before Bracknell ever set foot in that house. A cold dread settled in my stomach. Then who? Rook's gaze darted toward the window, as if expecting something, someone, to be standing beyond it. His voice dropped to barely a whisper, the one who wanted it all along. Holmes stepped closer. Who? Rook's mouth opened. But before he could answer, a loud crash shattered the silence. The window behind us burst inward, shards of glass exploding into the room. The candlelight flickered wildly as a gust of wind howled through the space. And then, a thick, curling mass of crimson mist poured into the room. Lord Ashcombe let out a strangled cry. I grabbed Holmes's arm, instinctively pulling him back as the mist coiled and churned, spreading across the floor in a slow, creeping wave. And in the center of it, barely visible, a shadow began to take shape. Holmes's voice was ice. Watson. Yes, I managed. He turned to me, his gaze like steel. Run. Chapter 10. Holmes's command was clear, but my body hesitated, transfixed by the writhing mass of crimson mist that curled through the broken window. It moved as though it were alive, thick tendrils stretching outward, its unnatural glow pulsating like the breath of some unseen entity. Lord Ashcombe stumbled back, his face ashen. What is that? He gasped. Dr. Rook, still seated at his desk, did not move. His sunken eyes were wide, his breath shallow. His fingers clutched the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned bone white. Holmes seized my arm. Watson, now. His urgency shattered my trance, and I moved, barely managing to drag Lord Ashcombe with me. Holmes was already pulling Rook from his chair, but the old man barely seemed aware of his surroundings. The mist thickened, spreading rapidly across the room, and within its curling mass, the shadow took form, a figure indistinct but unmistakably human. A voice, low, rasping, neither fully human nor entirely unnatural, spoke from within the swirling vapor. Too late. The very air seemed to constrict. My chest tightened as I struggled to breathe, my lungs resisting each inhalation. The acrid metallic scent was overpowering now, seeping into my very senses, numbing my limbs. Rook let out a strangled gasp. No, it wasn't supposed to be this way. Holmes tightened his grip on the doctor, his own breath sharp but controlled. "Move," he barked. We stumbled into the hallway just as the mist surged forward, slamming the door shut behind us with a violent bang. The sound echoed through the old house, reverberating like a warning bell in the dead of night. For a brief moment there was silence, then a thud, and another. Something, someone, was on the other side of the door. Holmes didn't wait to find out what. Downstairs, now. We tore down the narrow staircase, our hurried footsteps hammering against the wooden steps. The very walls of the house seemed to tremble, as if reacting to the entity's presence above us. Holmes reached the bottom first, throwing open the door to the street. A blast of cold night air met us, dispelling some of the suffocating oppression that clung to our lungs. We barely made it past the threshold before a sound erupted from above, a scream, inhuman and distorted, shattering the night's stillness. It was not the cry of man nor beast, but something caught between both, an agonizing wail of fury and despair. Holmes shoved Rook forward, practically dragging him onto the cobbled street. Lord Ashcombe followed, his face slick with perspiration, his limbs trembling violently. I turned, gasping for breath, expecting the mist to pour from the broken window, to follow us out into the London night. But instead, nothing. The house stood still, dark, its windows vacant and lifeless. The mist was gone. The entity, whatever it was, had retreated, or worse, it had never left. Holmes straightened, brushing the dust from his coat with swift, methodical movements. His eyes remained locked on the house, sharp and analytical, as though he was staring at a riddle he had yet to solve. Lord Ashcombe was bent over, hands on his knees, struggling to regain his composure. "Dear God," he panted. What in the devil's name was that?" Holmes exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "A manifestation," he murmured, "a reaction to the Ethereum, or rather, to those who seek it." Rook let out a weak, wheezing laugh. "You still do not understand?" Holmes turned sharply. "Then explain it to me, Doctor." Rook staggered, his legs barely holding his frail form. I moved instinctively to steady him, but he shook his head. His hollow eyes bore into Holmes, his voice raw and trembling. "It is not just a chemical compound, not merely some alchemical discovery. The Ethereum binds to the mind. It does not simply kill, it feeds." A chill ran through me. "Feeds?" Rook nodded weakly. "It draws upon the deepest fears of those exposed to it. It manifests terror, amplifies it, makes it real. Forsyth, he knew this. And yet he continued his work, believing he could master it." He gave a sharp, humorless chuckle. "But it was never meant to be controlled." Holmes remained still, his face unreadable. "Then why was Forsyth killed?" Rook inhaled sharply. "Because he was no longer needed." The words sent a shiver through me. Lord Ashcombe paled. You mean to say someone used him? Rook's gaze drifted to the house once more, his frail frame trembling. The Ethereum, he whispered. The book, the one who watches, they are all connected. Holmes tilted his head. And this one who watches, who are they? Rook let out a slow, shuddering breath. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, The true owner of the Crimson Codex. A heavy silence settled over us. Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. And where might we find this owner? Rook's gaze flickered toward the shadows of the street. His breath hitched, his eyes darting left, then right, as though he expected something to be watching him even now. Then he met Holmes' gaze one final time. You don't find him, he rasped. He finds you. A chill swept over me. The street, for all its quiet, suddenly felt too exposed, the air too still. Holmes turned away from Rook, his sharp gaze scanning the street, the rooftops, the alleyways. I had seen that expression before, when he was hunting when he knew the predator was near, but had yet to reveal itself. We leave, Holmes said briskly, immediately. Lord Ashcombe wasted no time in obeying. He pulled his coat tightly around himself, his gaze darting behind him, as if expecting the crimson mist to reappear at any moment. Rook, however, did not move. He stood still, staring at the broken window above. Holmes glanced at him. Dr. Rook, the old man exhaled, his voice so soft I almost missed it. I never should have read that book. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward his house, disappearing into the darkness within. Holmes did not stop him. Neither did I. For deep in my heart, I knew Rook had already sealed his fate. Chapter 11. The street outside Dr. Elias Rook's house was eerily silent as we stepped away. The cold London air thick with the weight of all that had transpired. The gas lamps flickered weakly, their glow barely enough to cut through the lingering mist that clung to the cobblestones. Holmes moved with purpose, his long strides cutting through the night. But his gaze was distant, his mind lost in rapid calculations. Lord Ashcombe, still visibly shaken, pulled his coat tighter around himself. You should have stopped him, he murmured, glancing back toward the darkened house. Rook is a dead man. Holmes did not break his stride. No, my lord, he said evenly. Dr. Rook was already dead the moment he opened the Crimson Codex. A chill ran through me. I had sensed it too. Rook's resignation, the quiet finality in his voice. He had accepted his fate, perhaps even welcomed it. Holmes turned abruptly onto a side street, leading us toward a waiting hansom cab. He gave the driver an address, one I did not recognize, before settling into the seat. I climbed in beside him, Lord Ashcombe following hesitantly. As the cab rattled forward, I finally spoke. Holmes, where are we going? He exhaled sharply. To the one place in London where secrets are kept in ink, rather than whispers, the archives. I frowned. The archives. But surely... The answer is in the book, Watson, he interrupted, tapping the Crimson Codex, which he had kept safely within his coat. And books, my dear fellow, always leave a trail. Lord Ashcombe shook his head. What exactly are you looking for? Holmes turned his piercing gaze upon him. The owner? A silence followed. The owner, I repeated slowly. Holmes nodded. If what Rook said was true, the Crimson Codex did not belong to Forsyth, nor to Rook, nor, I suspect, to anyone who has possessed it in recent years. Someone else has always been watching, waiting, allowing the book to pass from hand to hand until it reaches its intended reader. A terrible thought dawned on me. And if Forsyth was the intended reader? Holmes met my gaze, his expression unreadable. Then Forsyth's death was not an accident. It was the book fulfilling its purpose. Lord Ashcombe exhaled sharply. You believe this book is being used as a weapon? Holmes tilted his head slightly. A weapon, yes, but not in the conventional sense. No bullet, no blade. The Crimson Codex is a different kind of tool, one that does not kill its victims, but instead chooses them. A shiver ran down my spine. The cab turned sharply, pulling up before an old, unassuming building nestled between taller, grander structures. The British Library Archives. Holmes wasted no time. He stepped down, smoothing his coat, and strode towards the entrance. A night clerk sat at the desk, half asleep. But Holmes's presence alone was enough to stir him into alertness. I require access to all records concerning the Crimson Codex, Holmes announced. The clerk blinked. Sir, Holmes slid a calling card across the desk. The man hesitated, then sighed. Very well, Mr. Holmes, but I can't imagine there's much to find. Holmes gave a thin smile. You would be surprised. The next hour was spent in a dimly lit reading room, poring over records and catalogues. I had seen Holmes work in silence many times, but there was something different about him now. A sharper intensity, an urgency that even he rarely displayed. Finally, he stopped. His finger traced a single yellowed entry in an old acquisition ledger. His expression shifted, something between intrigue and grim satisfaction. I leaned in. The entry was brief, almost insignificant. The Crimson Codex date of entry, 16 sous for original owner, unknown final destination, private collection of Lord Everard Harrington. Harrington, I murmured. I don't recognize the name. Lord Ashcombe stiffened. I do. Holmes lifted his gaze. Then tell us. Ashcombe swallowed, his voice tight. The Harrington estate was one of the most infamous in England during the late 17th century. Lord Everard Harrington was an eccentric nobleman, obsessed with forbidden knowledge. His collection was said to include texts so dangerous that even scholars feared to read them. Some claimed he conducted experiments, dark rituals drawn from the very books he hoarded. Holmes exhaled. And what became of him? Ashcombe hesitated. He vanished. A beat of silence. Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw the flicker of triumph in his eyes. Of course he did. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. Holmes, if the Crimson Codex originated with Harrington, then this has been going on for centuries. Holmes shut the ledger with a quiet finality, which means the deaths it has left in its wake are not a consequence. He met my gaze. They are a pattern. At that moment, a sharp knock rapped against the door of the archive room. We turned. A librarian stood there, his expression uneasy. Pardon me, gentlemen, But a message just arrived for you, Mr. Holmes. Holmes accepted the folded paper without a word. The librarian hesitated, then added, "The messenger left no name, only that it was urgent." Holmes unfolded the note. His sharp eyes scanned the words, his fingers tightening as he read. I leaned in, my breath catching as I saw the message written in deep red ink. It contained only 3 words. Chapter 12. Holmes, fingers tightened around the note, his sharp eyes scanning the deep red ink. I could see the flicker of thought racing behind his gaze, calculations forming, dismissing, reshaping into something new. Lord Ashcombe's breath was audible in the heavy silence. "What does it mean?" he asked, his voice hushed. Holmes did not immediately answer. Instead, he held the paper up to the gaslight, tilting it slightly. The ink caught the glow in an unusual way. Too thick, too dark. He ran his thumb lightly over the words, "Not ink," he murmured. "Blood." A chill ran through me. "Whose?" Holmes did not respond. He folded the note with meticulous care and slipped it into his coat pocket. "That, my dear Watson, is a question we do not yet have the luxury of answering." Lord Ashcombe shifted uncomfortably. "This is a warning, Holmes." Holmes gave a small, unreadable smile. "Indeed, but whether it is meant to deter us or draw us in further remains to be seen." I frowned. "Surely, after everything we have uncovered, we cannot ignore this. Someone is aware of our every move." Holmes exhaled, his fingers tapping against the wooden table. "Precisely why we must move carefully, Watson." He turned to Lord Ashcombe. "Do you still have influence within certain circles, my lord?" Ashcombe blinked. Well, yes. But what are you asking?" Holmes's gaze sharpened. A name such as Harrington does not fade from history without effort. If his estate held the Crimson Codex, then there may be records that never made it to the public eye. "I need you to reach out, quietly. Someone knows what happened to that book before it fell into Forsyth's hands." Ashcombe nodded, though he still looked uneasy. "I will do what I can." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, you and I have an errand to attend to." I hesitated. "Where?" Holmes retrieved his pocket watch and flipped it open. "Dr. Rook's house." Lord Ashcombe's expression darkened. It's a mistake, Holmes. That man is beyond saving." Holmes snapped the watch shut. "Perhaps, but it is not his life I intend to save." I felt a deep sense of unease settle over me. "Holmes, surely we should proceed with caution." His lips twitched. "My dear Watson, have you ever known me to do otherwise?" I refrained from answering as we stepped back into the cold London night. The journey back to Dr. Rook's residence was a silent one. The hansom cab rattled along the damp cobblestones, the city still shrouded in an unnatural fog. Holmes sat rigidly, his gloved fingers pressed together in deep thought. As we neared the townhouse, an unsettling feeling coiled in my chest. I had seen many a man embrace his fate, but there had been something different about Rook, something resigned. Holmes must have sensed my unease. If my suspicions are correct, Watson, Rook has already paid his price. What matters now is what he left behind. The cab came to a slow halt before the residence. The house was dark. The broken window from earlier gaped like a hollow eye socket, the curtains inside shifting slightly with the wind. Holmes stepped down first, striding toward the door without hesitation. I followed, my senses alert. The street was too quiet. Holmes knocked once, then again. No answer. He tried the handle. Unlocked. Exchanging a glance, we stepped inside. The air within was heavy, thick with a strange metallic tang that made my stomach turn. The candle on the desk still burned. Its wax pooled over the edges like frozen tears. Papers lay scattered across the floor, some torn, others stained, and then the scent of something far worse. Holmes moved swiftly, his boots silent against the wooden boards. He disappeared through the hall, and I followed, only for both of us to stop in our tracks. At the base of the staircase, slumped against the banister, was Dr. Elias Rook, or what was left of him. His body was stiff, his face frozen in the same expression of unrelenting terror I had seen on Edwin Forsyth. His eyes, wide and unseeing, stared into the void. His lips, slightly parted, seemed to be whispering a final warning that had never been spoken. A fine layer of crimson mist still clung to the air around him. I swallowed hard. We were too late. Holmes knelt beside the body, his expression unreadable. He examined Rook's fingers, blackened at the tips as though burned, his collar slightly askew, revealing faint bruising at the throat. Then, without a word, Holmes reached into Rook's pocket and withdrew a small scrap of parchment. It was crumpled, as though clutched in a dying grip. Holmes unfolded it carefully. My breath caught. It was a name, scrawled hastily, as though written in desperation, as though it had been the last thing Rook had done before his life was stolen from him. Harrington House. Holmes stood slowly, slipping the note into his coat. "Watson," he murmured, "we have our next destination." I glanced down at Rook's lifeless form, a cold dread sinking into my bones. Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, his sharp, calculating eyes, held something deeper than logic. "A reckoning, Harrington House," I repeated quietly. "The origin of the Crimson Codex." Holmes nodded once. "And the place where all of this began." He turned, sharply on his heel, striding toward the door, his coat billowing behind him. "Come, Watson. It is time we finally meet the one who has been waiting for us." And as we stepped into the night, I could not shake the feeling that the Crimson Codex had already decided our fates. Chapter 13. The journey to Harrington House was unlike any other I had taken with Sherlock Holmes. The weight of the case pressed heavily upon us, an invisible force coiling around our very breath. The hansom cab rattled through the darkened streets, the distant glow of gas lamps barely piercing the thickening mist that had begun to settle over London, like a shroud. Holmes sat in a brooding silence, his fingers pressed together beneath his chin. His gaze was fixed on a point far beyond the confines of the cab, his mind undoubtedly assembling the final pieces of this dreadful puzzle. Lord Ashcombe had insisted on accompanying us. Though visibly shaken by the night's horrors, his jaw was set in determination. "This madness began in my family's circles, Holmes," he had said before we departed. "I must see it to the end." I, too, could feel the inevitable weight of our destination. Harrington House, the place where the Crimson Codex had first been recorded, where its legacy had taken root. And now, the place where Holmes believed we would find the one who had been watching all along. I could not shake the sense that we were walking willingly into a trap. "Holmes," I finally said, breaking the silence, "if Harrington House truly holds the answer, why has no one sought it before?" Holmes exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening. "Because, my dear Watson, the answers are only revealed to those who are meant to see them." I frowned. "Meant?" turned to me then, his expression unreadable. "Rook was not the first to die for this knowledge, and he will not be the last. The Codex does not pass from hand to hand by chance. It chooses its victims. It lures them in piece by piece until they can no longer turn away. And when their use is served, they die," I finished grimly. Holmes nodded once. Lord Ashcombe cleared his throat. "Then what of you, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes met his gaze steadily. "That remains to be seen." A silence settled over us. The cab slowed, the driver pulling the reins with a hesitant glance over his shoulder. "End of the road. Gents," he called, "you'll have to walk from here." We stepped down onto the path, the damp earth soft beneath our boots. Before us, beyond the swirling mist, stood Harrington House. It was a monolith of the past, its towering form looming against the night sky. Ivy strangled the once grand facade, its windows dark and hollow. A wrought-iron gate, rusted with time, stood partially ajar, as if waiting for our arrival. Holmes pushed it open without hesitation. A long, overgrown pathway led to the entrance, flanked by the skeletal remains of hedges that had long since withered away. The house itself was eerily silent. No wind, no stirring of life within its walls. Yet something watched. I felt it. Lord Ashcombe hesitated beside me. "I do not like this, Holmes." Holmes smiled faintly. "Nor do I, my lord, which is precisely why we must proceed." He strode forward, and with no other choice, we followed. The great wooden doors of Harrington House loomed before us. Holmes reached out and pressed a hand against them. To my surprise, they gave way with little resistance. The air that greeted us was thick with dust and time, the scent of damp wood, aged paper, and something else, something metallic, lingered in the darkness beyond. Holmes stepped inside first. I followed, gripping my cane tightly, Lord Ashcombe just behind me. The entrance hall was vast, its high ceilings disappearing into shadow. Faded tapestries clung to the walls, their depictions lost to decay. A grand staircase wound upward, disappearing into darkness. And then, a sound, a low, echoing whisper, as though the very walls of Harrington House were breathing. Holmes stilled, his head tilted slightly, listening. Lord Ashcombe whispered, "Did you hear that?" I nodded. My heart pounded against my ribs. We are not alone. Holmes moved forward. His footsteps were measured, precise. We followed cautiously, the weight of the house pressing in around us. Then we saw it. At the far end of the hall, upon a grand mahogany table sat the Crimson Codex, open, waiting. Holmes exhaled slowly. "So," he murmured, "the invitation is complete." I swallowed hard. "This is a trap, Holmes." His lips curled slightly. "Undoubtedly." And then the doors behind us slammed shut. A heavy silence followed. Lord Ashcombe turned sharply. "What?" But Holmes was already moving. His eyes darted across the room, his mind racing ahead of us all. He reached the codex and hovered, his fingers just above its open pages, scanning the text. Then his entire body tensed. I stepped forward. "Holmes." His voice was low, controlled. "Watson." "Yes." "Do not read the words." A chill raced through me. "What?" Holmes turned sharply, his expression sharper than I had ever seen it. "This book is not what we thought. It is not a mere record." I hesitated. "Then what?" A summoning. The whisper returned. Only this time, it was not the house that spoke. It was the voice of something else, a voice that did not belong to the living. Holmes closed the book with a decisive motion. "We must leave now." But as he turned, a shadow moved at the top of the grand staircase. And for the first time since I had met Sherlock Holmes, I saw something flicker in his eyes, not fear or recognition. "Holmes," I breathed. "Who is that?" Holmes's jaw tightened. The true owner of the Crimson Codex. The figure began to descend, the whispering grew louder, and the house came alive. Chapter 14. The figure at the top of the grand staircase did not rush, nor did it linger. Instead, it descended with deliberate precision, the weight of its presence pressing against the very air. The whispering grew louder, slipping between the ancient walls, curling through the dim corridors of Harrington House. It was not a single voice, but many. A chorus of fragmented murmurs, some barely audible, others thick with intent. I could feel the hairs rise along the back of my neck. Holmes did not move. His keen eyes were locked onto the descending figure, his breath measured, his posture poised as if preparing for an unseen battle. Lord Ashcombe swallowed audibly beside me. "Who is that?" Holmes's fingers flexed at his sides. "The one who has been watching," he murmured. "The true master of the Crimson Codex." The figure reached the landing. Now, in the dim gaslight, I could see him fully. A man, or at least what had once been one. His tall frame was draped in a long black coat, the fabric old yet strangely untouched by time. His hair was silvered, though his face bore no true age, only a sharpness that did not belong to the living nor the dead. But it was his eyes that held me captive. Cold, unrelenting, unnatural, they gleamed not with light, but with the absence of it. A void so complete that I felt as though if I gazed too long, I might lose myself within them. The whispering ceased. The house itself seemed to exhale. Then, in a voice smooth as oil and deep as the grave, the man spoke. "Welcome," he said, "Sherlock Holmes." A single bead of sweat traced down my spine. He had spoken only Holmes's name, but I could feel the weight of his awareness upon us all. Holmes remained unshaken. "You expected me," he said evenly. The man's lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. "I have been expecting you for some time." Lord Ashcombe stiffened. "Who are you?" The man turned his cold gaze upon him. "You know me, Lord Ashcombe. You know my name, though you have buried it within the annals of history." A flicker of realization dawned across Ashcombe's face. His skin turned a shade paler. "It cannot be," he whispered. Holmes exhaled sharply. "Harrington," he stated. I recoiled. "Impossible. Harrington vanished over 200 years ago." The man, Harrington, tilted his head slightly, as if amused. "And yet, here I stand." Holmes's expression did not change. "You are no spirit," he said, "no phantom. You are a man." Harrington smiled, this time with something almost resembling mirth. "And what is a man, Mr. Holmes, if not the sum of the knowledge he has gathered, of the secrets he has unlocked? The Crimson Codex is more than words upon a page. It is the path to eternity." A slow dread settled in my bones. Holmes's voice remained steady. "It is sure, and Shioth, and Forsyth." Harrington's expression darkened. A student, a seeker, but he lacked the mind to see the truth. He thought himself its master, but the book does not serve. It does not yield. He was unworthy. A beat of silence. "And Bracknell?" Holmes asked. Harrington barely spared the name a thought. "A parasite. He sought to steal knowledge he did not understand." His gaze flicked toward me. "As do you, Dr. Watson." The chill in my veins deepened. Holmes took a calculated step forward, his eyes never leaving Harrington's. "You orchestrated this." Harrington's lips pressed into something that was neither confirmation nor denial. "The book must always find its way to the right hands." Holmes's voice was ice. "You led Forsyth to it. You let it consume him." Harrington's expression did not change. Forsyth's death was irrelevant. His failure was inevitable. My pulse pounded. "Then why are we here?" I demanded. "What is it that you want from Holmes?" Harrington turned his gaze back to Holmes. "The book has chosen its next reader," he said simply. "The last piece of the puzzle. The final successor." A silence fell over us. And then, with a quiet certainty, Harrington spoke once more. "The book has chosen you, Mr. Holmes." My breath left me. Holmes did not so much as blink. His entire form remained frozen, like a man who had been expecting this all along. Lord Ashcombe whispered, "Holmes, you cannot." Holmes lifted a hand, silencing him. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, with the slow, deliberate movements of a man testing the very fabric of fate, Holmes turned back toward the table. Toward the Crimson Codex. I felt my heart hammer in my chest. Holmes. But he did not stop. His hand hovered over the book's ancient pages, fingers just a hair's breadth away from touching them. A slow, knowing smile spread across Harrington's face. I had never known fear, not true fear, until that moment, because for the first time in my life, I realized that there was something greater than logic, greater than deduction, something even Sherlock Holmes himself might not be able to resist. And as his fingers finally, inevitably, brushed against the pages of the Crimson Codex, the house whispered once more, and the darkness welcomed him home. Chapter 15. Holmes's fingers brushed the ancient parchment of the Crimson Codex, and the very air seemed to shift. A low vibration trembled through the floor, barely perceptible, but undeniably there. The gaslight flickered wildly, and for the briefest moment, the walls of Harrington House felt closer, as though they had been waiting for this exact moment. Hush fell over the room. Then Holmes did something I did not expect. He hesitated. His fingers did not fully press down on the pages. They lingered, hovering, testing, feeling for something unseen. His jaw was tight, his breath measured. But I saw it. A flicker of doubt, a battle waged in silence. Harrington's voice cut through the air like a knife. "You feel it, don't you?" Holmes remained silent. Harrington took a step forward, his long coat shifting like a shadow. His eyes gleamed, dark, endless voids in the dim light. "The book is not merely a text. It is a vessel, a conduit of knowledge beyond the reach of ordinary men." I swallowed hard. Knowledge that has killed every man who has sought it. Harrington barely spared me a glance. Because they were unworthy. Holmes's hand hovered still. His breath was slow, controlled. But something in his expression had changed. Harrington pressed on, his voice smooth as oil. "It has always been leading to this moment, Mr. Holmes. You, of all men, understand the necessity of knowledge, the endless pursuit of truth." His lips curled slightly. "Is that not why you have followed its trail this far?" Holmes's fingers twitched. I stepped forward, my pulse hammering. "Holmes, do not do this." He did not move. Lord Ashcombe, too, found his voice. "Holmes, you are the most rational man I have ever met. But if you turn this page, you may never be the same again." Holmes exhaled sharply through his nose, and for the first time since we had entered Harrington House, he turned his gaze away from the book. His eyes met mine, and for a fleeting moment, I saw something strange there. Not fear, not hesitation, calculation. And then, in the smallest, sharpest motion, Holmes flicked his wrist, knocking over the oil lamp. The flames erupted instantly, licking across the brittle parchment of the Crimson Codex. Harrington let out an inhuman snarl. "No, you fool!" The house groaned as though alive. The whispering turned to screaming. The very walls trembled. Holmes was already moving. He seized my arm and wrenched me back. "Watson, run!" Lord Ashcombe stumbled, his voice a cry lost in the growing cacophony of voices, of wind, of something deeper, something furious. Harrington lunged towards the burning book, his skeletal fingers reaching out in a desperate attempt to salvage it. But it was too late. The fire devoured the pages hungrily, as though it had been waiting centuries for this moment. The air cracked with a deafening boom. The house shuddered. A force, neither physical nor entirely tangible, rippled outward. Blicking, walls trembled, the gaslight shattered, and the crimson mist that had haunted us for so long howled in agony as it was ripped apart. Holmes dragged me toward the entrance, his grip like iron. "Move, Watson." Lord Ashcombe followed, his breaths ragged as we stumbled down the grand hall, the very foundations of Harrington House shaking beneath our feet. Behind us, Harrington let out a single piercing cry, one that did not belong to a man at all, and then silence. The moment we breached the threshold, the world snapped back into place. The night was still, the air cold and fresh, the sky stretched overhead, dark and untouched by the chaos we had left behind. The house stood behind us, quiet, no flames, no smoke, no trace of the horror that had unfolded within. I turned sharply, my heart hammering. Holmes! But something stopped me. The door, the entire house, was exactly as it had been when we arrived. No sign of fire, no sign of destruction, no sign that the Crimson Codex had ever burned at all. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. What is this? Lord Ashcombe was deathly pale. Was any of it real? Holmes stood in complete stillness, his sharp gaze fixed on the manor. Then, with slow, deliberate purpose, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew something, a single scrap of parchment. My blood ran cold. The corner of a page, scorched at the edges, a fragment of the Crimson Codex. I swallowed hard. Holmes! He did not look at me. His fingers curled around the fragment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned on his heel and walked toward the road, the mist swallowing him whole. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the house, at the night, at the impossible weight of what had just transpired. And as I followed after Holmes, one thought clawed its way to the front of my mind. The book had not been destroyed, not entirely, and whatever knowledge had been sealed within its pages, whatever truth had been waiting for its next reader, had found its way to Sherlock Holmes. Chapter 4:16. The fog swallowed us as we left Harrington House behind. No one spoke. The weight of what had transpired sat heavily between us, pressing against the very air we breathed. Holmes walked ahead, his long coat billowing slightly, his posture rigid. He had not spoken since we stepped onto the road. Lord Ashcombe, still, pale, stole a glance back at the manor, as if expecting it to vanish. But it remained there, looming, unchanged, untouched, as though it had simply absorbed the horrors within and returned to its slumber. I kept my gaze on Holmes. His right hand was clenched around the scrap of parchment, the only surviving fragment of the Crimson Codex. I should have demanded he cast it into the fire, that he rid himself of it. But I knew Holmes, and I knew that was impossible. The cab we had arranged earlier stood waiting at the far end of the path. The driver, unaware of the nightmares we had just escaped, tipped his hat and gestured to the open door. Holmes hesitated, not out of fear, not out of uncertainty, but because he was deciding. At last, without a word, he stepped into the cab. Lord Ashcombe and I exchanged a glance before following. As we rode back into the depths of London, I broke the silence. Holmes, you must tell me what you're thinking. He did not immediately respond. His gaze was fixed on the passing streets, his fingers still curled around the burnt parchment. Finally, he exhaled. "Watson," he murmured, "do you recall what Harrington said?" I frowned. About the book choosing its reader. A slight nod. Yes, but more importantly, about what the Crimson Codex truly was. Not merely a text, but a vessel. A key of sorts. I felt an uneasy weight settle in my chest. A key to what? Holmes turned then, his gaze sharp. To something greater. Lord Ashcombe exhaled sharply. I will not hear of it, Holmes. That book, whatever it was, is gone. Holmes gave him a measured look. Is it? He held up the scrap of parchment. Both stared at it. The edges were charred, the ink slightly faded, but the symbols, those strange, twisting glyphs, remained intact. Holmes turned it between his fingers. A single fragment, yet it remains legible, almost as if it wanted to survive. My hands tightened into fists. Holmes, listen to me. You said it yourself. This book has claimed every man who has pursued it. Edwin Forsyth, Bracknell, Rook. If you continue down this path, you may. Holmes gave me a small, unreadable smile. May what, Watson? I hesitated. You may lose yourself. The cab rattled over a cobbled street. Holmes said nothing. Lord Ashcombe shifted. Whatever remains of that book should be destroyed, Holmes. Holmes tilted his head slightly. And yet, the moment I do so, we will have lost the last remaining piece of the puzzle. I exhaled in frustration. The puzzle is finished. Holmes' gaze darkened. No, Watson, it is not. He unfolded the parchment and held it to the dim lantern light within the cab. The symbols glowed faintly, an effect of the ink's age, or perhaps something more. Look closely, he murmured. I hesitated but obeyed, and then I saw it. Beneath the surface markings, beneath the symbols, another line of text had been written, almost invisible, buried beneath layers of ink and time. I squinted. It was a single name, a name neither Forsyth, nor Bracknell, nor even Harrington had ever spoken. Holmes's voice was quiet. It appears we were looking at the wrong man all along. Lord Ashcombe frowned. What do you mean? Holmes slowly lowered the parchment. The true master of the Crimson Codex. I swallowed hard. Harrington? Holmes shook his head. No, he murmured. Harrington was merely a guardian, a keeper of knowledge. His fingers tapped against the burnt edges of the parchment. The true architect of this mystery, the one who wrote this text, who created the Codex, has remained hidden. I felt a chill race through me. And who is that? Holmes held up the parchment. The name was written in careful, deliberate script, untouched by the flames that had devoured the rest of the book. I read it aloud. Jonathan Harrow. Lord Ashcombe paled. That name. Holmes nodded. You recognize it? Ashcombe swallowed. I heard it once before. My father mentioned it when I was a boy. A scholar, an occultist, a man who disappeared without a trace nearly 3 centuries ago. Holmes leaned back, his expression unreadable. And yet, his name remains. A deep, uneasy silence filled the cab. I felt the weight of something shift in the air, something unfinished, something waiting. Holmes let out a slow breath. Then, in a voice quieter than I had ever heard from him, he said, "The game, Watson, is not yet over."